several people that we've already spoken with do come to the field with their own individual networks, and one way to expand on that is to really sort of integrate those networks to really maximize their potential for change and to really start to begin to really build a strong infrastructure for the movement.
Few challenges facing our democracy are more urgent and deserving of citizen attention than those involving the ownership, management, governance, and use of the major media in this country. I'm Larry Hansen, Vice President of the Joyce Foundation. In conjunction with CAN TV, we are pleased to bring you the following coverage of the National Conference on Media Reform. Political and community leaders, journalists, educators, and media activists from around the country gathered in Madison, Wisconsin in the fall of 2003 in response to the call to transform the media into a force that supports democracy and the public interest. We hope that this coverage helps to inform your understanding of this important issue.
Greetings. I'd like to welcome everybody to the session today. How do we win? Sharing strategies, models, and ideas about making change. My name's David Haas with the Grantmakers in Film and Electronic Media, which is an affinity group or an association of funders, broadly speaking, who care about media. And also with me today to present and talk about sessions, we have Gary Spilka and Sheetal Matani from the OMG Center for Collaborative Learning and the project team for the Listening Project. And I'll say a bit about that in just a moment. We also have for our breakout sessions, which we're going to have a little bit later, Eliza Dichter and Catherine Borgman Arboleda from CIMA, the Center for International Media Action, a group that provides nonprofits tools and services for media advocacy, education, and reform groups. Anyways, a lot of that can be followed up later, but I wanted to be sure to introduce our speakers. Oh, I'm sorry, and Lisa Nutter, also from the OMG Center. Today, I think I just wanted to say a little bit about what our goals were for this session. It's a very short time, and we're all very busy. We're trying to pack a lot in, but the Listening Project is a survey of the field, interviews of all sorts of constituents, funders, practitioners, researchers, people based in community-based efforts, as well as national advocacy groups, and so on. And the goal here is not to present solutions by any means, but to take the goal of the Listening Project, which is ongoing, is to try and get a feel for what's going on out there, what the perspectives are, to raise issues and questions about how this field or broader endeavor for media reform, media justice, and advocacy can strengthen. And I think that's hopefully the goal of this session, to, after a presentation, which will come shortly, to break out. There will be a brief point for questions of clarification, which is not about the broader topics, but just to say, you know, you said such and such, can you just say, what is that organization, or clarifying questions for just a few minutes, and then we're going to break into breakout groups where those of us who are participating can share ideas of what might have worked, as well as strategies for working together across different fields. Then we're going to reconvene and hopefully share some of that. We're going to do our best to encapsulate that in this session. And once again, I thank you all very much for taking part in this, and I'd like to turn it over to, who's going to start? Gary. Yeah.
Okay, I just wanted to give you an overview of what we mean by the field, by the movement, who we're talking about, and how we're talking about it. We are talking about a network of diverse players working on a variety of issues that are focused on media and communications technology in an improved way and making it more responsive to the public interest. We're talking about folks that are broadly working on issues that are related, and you'll see in a little more, in a few minutes, the kinds of people that we talked about. But we're talking about the set of players that are going to make this system work, that are going to be able to work together to make these changes. What we found was that folks tend to think of themselves, and this is not unusual. We've worked in a number of areas, a number of movements. People think of themselves in the framework of the kind of work that they do, whether it be by content, activists, advocates, researchers, and that people organize themselves on single issues or one or two issues. The field as itself, or the players have been mobilizing around issues. Okay? While this is really critical, how do we think about strategy as a whole, where the kinds of issues that we raise? How do we think in the long term about building a sustainable infrastructure to continue the work? Okay? All right. We have a question here. We have 4 different kinds of people, at least that we talk to, and you should know we talk to over 60 people across the country who fit into a set of different categories. And I'd like to just get a sense of where you think of yourselves. Who here is involved in content issues, influencing or making content, if you could raise your hands? Content, well, maybe I should go through this first, and you'll get a better sense of what we mean, okay? What we meant by influencing and making content, it had to do with folks who are working to make content that was improved at a local or national level. It could be public radio, public TV, independent media. It could be those working towards improving that or those actually doing it. Okay? A media critic, you might fit into several categories, actually. So some folks. Yes, I'm going to do that, yes. Another category are those of you that are working on impacting industry practices and standards. So it could be building and leveraging relationships with industry leaders, decision makers to influence standards, or working with industry for better technology design that protects the public interest. Or some of you are working on holding industry accountable. So these are clustered by issues, kind of not necessarily advocacy or research necessarily, but some of them will be cut across several areas. Then there are a number of folks who work specifically on structural and regulatory change, usually aimed at local or federal government, advocating for better policies that serve the public interest, taking on legal battles in these interests, building and leveraging relationships with policymakers to elevate concerns about policy issues. And then there's knowledge and capacity building, substantiating and articulating the case for the need for change, providing information that supports the work of advocates and activists, and providing technical assistance and skill building in the field. Okay, and again, you may fall in several categories, but just to get a feel for where you stand, who of you, or which of you, if you could show by a raise of hands, are primarily focused on content issues? So that's about a quarter to a third, okay? How about impacting industry practices and standards? Okay, a smaller group. And how about structural and regulatory change? And then how about knowledge and capacity building? Okay, so the primary number, the largest number here, are really focused on content issues. But just to give you a sense of the voice that we heard and around key assumptions that drove the work, with regards to content, we heard as an area of focus is that what's coming through the mainstream media pipelines is garbage, and it's not diverse enough. That sort of captures the key ideas. What we heard with the folks working on impacting industry practices and standards was many of the problems we see, particularly on the internet, could be resolved by better design and industry policy. And the internet was just one example. But that policy could drive the industry a little differently. Structural and regulatory changes had to do a lot with the kinds of things that related to this assumption. What we have is bad policy. It's creating bad outcomes for the public and eroding principles of democracy. And we've heard that a lot in the meetings that we've been sitting in today. With regard to knowledge and capacity building, We heard advocates and activists need sound research and data to deepen their learning and make compelling cases. Certainly, since data plays a role in policy formation, we need to strengthen organizational capacities who would better support the work. So, next slide. Our assumption is that going forward, we need a lot of folks to be working towards the same goals, but that we all might come to this work with different, what we call pathways of change or kind of basic approaches to our work. Does that make sense? Any questions about that point? I think what we heard yesterday, well, everybody can come to this with a different perspective and very different central issues. We have to be thinking not only among ourselves here, but reaching out to the people who are not here. What are our common goals and broad interests? Okay, and a primary example had to do with the recent battle on the FCC. It was a huge tent of players. Many of them you might not want to have coffee or a drink with, but yet we had very common interests. Okay.
Based on many of the conversations that we've had with advocates and activists doing media justice and media reform work, we've identified and heard several issues that we think are important to sustaining the field and for the field to really make an impact as it moves forward. And as you can see on the slide, there are several areas. The first includes the need to build informed constituencies that can really press for change. And these constituencies might include different kinds of publics, policymakers, opinion leaders, policy elites, and along with reporters and journalists who might be in the mainstream press and who have a stake or who are concerned about the field or who actually have reason to be concerned about a variety of these issues. The next point is the need for developing relevant messages, and that's often tied to the need for building constituencies, and it sort of depends on how well you can build constituencies. And the need to actually build or develop messages that really resonate with different audiences so that we can so that they can hook into these efforts. We've also heard from many people about the need to really work harder at building and expanding their networks and strategic alliances and forming strategic alliances to really improve the impact of the work. Several people that we've already spoken with do come to the field with their own individual networks, and one way to expand on that is to really sort of integrate those networks to really maximize their potential for change and to really start to begin to really build a strong infrastructure for the movement. The next issue that we heard, that there's a need for developing bridges across different communities. So that would be across between advocates on the Hill and activists working at a local level, between advocates and activists that have national and local infrastructures and NGOs with well-defined constituencies. And also the need for building bridges between applied academics to advocates and activists. So these are really important linkages that we see and that we've heard that need to really occur to sort of strengthen the movement and to strengthen these connections. The next issue that we heard in our conversations was the need to sort of to measure success and plan for impact. Many say that measuring success is sort of critical to sort of carving out a stake for the field in the world, especially in terms of funding. Establishing accountability with funders is really important, and to be able to do that, you need to really sort of track how well you're doing your work and to really be able to understand how you're being effective and where you can improve your effectiveness. But to be able to do that, it's sort of hard. I think this is sort of a challenging area because it's sometimes difficult to really measure impact in terms of policy outcomes and policy wins because the environment is sort of unpredictable. You don't know how decision makers are going to respond to a particular bill. But one of the things that I think we've been hearing in terms of how people would want to be able to define their success or measure their impact is in terms of how they're contributing to the policymaking process, what kinds of direct and indirect ways they are influencing the conversations, changing the debate, influencing the broader public to really think about these things and to exert pressure on policy, on the policymaking process. And we've also heard that there's a need to establish a greater definition for priorities in the work. In our conversations, we've heard, that the work, we get a sense that the work is sort of divided into different issue areas. So we have intellectual property as one issue area, media consolidation and diversity of viewpoints is another area, privacy and surveillance as another, digital technology, and in terms of thinking about movement and building a broad framework that sort of unifies these different areas, there's a need to sort of create a framework that sort of threads it all together in a way that people can understand and that the broader public can really engage with. We've also heard about the need to create a vision for what good policy and what good communications practice looks like, and sort of moving beyond complaining about what's wrong with it and admiring the problem, but to sort of proactively define for the broader public and for policymakers what's working and what needs to work well and how it can work well. And that also, I think, helps engage the public too in terms of thinking about having a vision for what we're all striving for. As with any field, there are several assets and needs that we've actually heard in this field as well, and it's something to think about in terms of planning as we go forward in the movement. And as there are many needs, we also need to keep in mind what the assets are, and we need to sort of build on those assets as we go forward. So in terms of several of the assets that we've heard that are sort of unique to this field, we've heard that, I'm sorry, just a second here, that, in our conversations, we've really sort of, what's come through is that there's a strong commitment and passion of advocates who have deep knowledge about the issues and communications policy and of communications policy issues and what their implications are. And so that's something that I think is really important to remember as we move forward, that there is a deep level of expertise here in the movement. But there's also a unique ability to predict what the issues are. Unlike with other fields, as in welfare reform, in the 1990s, it was sort of hard to know that that was going to be an issue and that welfare reform was going to be overhauled. However, when the internet sort of reached its point of growth, people quickly caught on to what the issues might be in terms of ownership and consolidation and concerns around content. We also there's a unique way that I think folks in the field use technology to advocate for their issues, and that was especially true with the FCC campaign, where organizers across the country use the internet to file or to create online petition forms so that thousands of people could express their views about the FCC rules. But people are also using the internet to share strategies and opinions and share strategies, organizing strategies, and to also distribute tools for organizing. So it's a very well-used tool in this field. We also heard from different players in the field that there are people in the field who have strong relationships with both people on a national level and on a local level, and those relationships are important for developing, I think, a wider spread understanding and knowledge of the issues, and to really advocate on several different levels, both local, community, and national. We've also and though we've acknowledged that there's a need to build and expand on networks, there are networks and constituencies that already exist, and to begin to, as I already said, to develop and build on those will be really important for moving forward, and to figure out ways that those can be established and more expanded, I think, will be key. And we've also come across people who have some really important critical relationships with people in the industry. And that's also just as critical and important to, I think, making changes within industry practice and standards as well. So, do I have enough time to go forward? But there are several needs that we've also heard in the field. And the first, I think we all recognize that there's a need for funding. This field needs more funding, and it deserves to have more funding. There's a lot going on here that needs to happen. But we've heard, but beyond funding, that there are some resource needs that we've specifically identified, and one is to really give people a space to sort of step back and think about the field and what it needs to do to move forward. So We need resources, I think, to share, reflect, and exchange on practice and strategy. We need resources to provide time and space for proactively defining agendas and proactively defining what good policy ought to look like, rather than reacting to what current bad policies exist, and rather than also putting out fires all the time. And we also need resources to support new leaders in the field. This is a field that obviously draws in a lot of younger people, and to really build that and to develop their expertise will be important as we go forward. The other key issues that we've heard is the need to support organizers and advocates in understanding how to build constituencies and to develop the right kinds of messages to really hook people in. So as we talked about before, resources that specifically give people the tools to do that and to understand how to connect with people will be very important.
Thank you very much. I'd like to just make two quick additional points. First of all, the entire presentation and ongoing work of the Listening Project is available on the web at the omgcenter.org. One moment. I'd also like to point out that this effort to canvass the field and identify gaps also includes grant makers and funders. On behalf of that nebulous crowd, I can say that there are a lot of issues raised there too, both from the field as well as within the funders. So I just wanted to underscore that we're a piece of that too. Gary, did you want to say one more thing? Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
The website is www.omgcenter.org/listen. It's the OMG Center for Collaborative Learning. And if you don't get it now, you can certainly get it from any one of us afterwards. Please, absolutely.
That's quite all right. One of the things that is unique about this field compared to other areas in which we worked, and we've worked in the areas of community development, we've worked in the areas of social welfare, the arts, and we were just reflecting on our conversation among several of us last night. This is one field that it's very hard and almost impossible to get public dollars to support the work and activity. So it's reliant on private foundations and private dollars. And that's an unusual case. But I should tell you, we did interview a number of people who are supporting this work or who could support this work. And we have a couple of observations about that. One is the funding community focus on this work is small, with very limited available funding and multiple funding priorities. So not only is there not a larger pool overall, because of the lack of government dollars, there is just the funding, the private dollars, and it's a relatively smaller group of people and smaller total numbers. We were really excited that a number of funders seemed genuinely interested in better understanding the work and how to support it. When we talked about well, certainly we talked to funders in the know and who were very close to the issues, but we talked to funders who were less aware. And this gets down to being smarter ourselves. How can we connect to some of these folks in a more direct, resonant way? How can we connect it to other areas of priorities that they may have? We'll talk more about that. But they have similar critiques as all of you. People are working independently, not connecting, and many of the challenges and assets that you saw earlier, they have similar observations. We were a little dismayed, and this gets back to us not only working harder, but working smarter. Few were willing to step up and understood about how they could really further support this work. They have many other competing demands. I heard it does resonate with a lot of us. They really want to understand better, and this is actually across the country, across the whole philanthropic, nonprofit, and government sector. People want to know what's the impact of our investment. What are we seeing that's changing? We have to get smarter about talking about it, about understanding it, understanding what we can change in short periods of time, what we can change in long periods of time, and have real measures. And that's a hard thing to do, but we have to get better at that. And that this has to do with the fact we think that there are a lot of young and emerging organizations, which we think is an enormous asset, but there's a great gap in understanding, particularly for the smaller young organizations, about what you have to do to access dollars, assuming that there are dollars there, but how to develop a track record, how to make a case with funders. And we think we can all be smarter about that, and there's lots of lessons we can draw on to do that. Did you want to add anything else, David, about these issues?
Just quickly, I would say that just to echo what was just said, that in the funding community, if there is, it's not really a community, but as you know, a universe of all sorts of planets and subplanets and individuals, really. I think, understanding is key, and these are complex issues. Getting out of the silos that we tend to fall in subject area is the same sort of dynamic. And just as other constituencies, being able to have a right message for the right audience. But no funders too small, or I think actually local, community, family foundations. If you have relationships, try and get the message across. And we're trying to also facilitate that process as well. Thank you.
Okay, this is the fun part, which is because we all get to learn from each other and who's in the room. What we're going to do is we're going to break up into 4 groups, Gary? 5 groups. Okay, we're going to break up into 5 groups, and we're going to do that by counting off. The groups are going to separate and go into different... Well, all right. So we'll split you into 5 groups. We're gonna spread out in this room, and also we're gonna be able to use the hallway and maybe even some other rooms. And each of us will join a group, and we're gonna be talking in these groups about 2 specific things. And the first thing is successes. We're gonna be sharing our successes. Some of these may be successes in media activism. And you can define that success however you want. If you want to define the success you've had in getting new people interested, that's a success. If you want to define the success you've had in getting money, that's a success. If you want to define the success in getting media to change, that's a success. If you don't have stories of media activism, there are other places we can learn from, so feel free to share those stories. The second thing we're going to talk about are lessons from other movements. Now, these may be movements you've been involved with, experiences you've had. It may be things you've learned about, seen, heard, specifically the things that really relate to the work that we're all talking about. What do we know about these other movements? How do they relate to our movements for media reform, media justice? How did people organize? How did they work together? How did it work? How were the issues framed? How were the messages communicated? How did it get out there? So as we split up, think about that. Think about what you'd like to share among yourselves, because what we'll do is we're going to ask one person in each group to volunteer as a scribe, take notes of the big key issues. We're going to come back together. We'll write up those key issues, and then we'll talk together collectively about, given all of what we've heard today from these excellent presentations, and given what we know from each other and what we learned in our small groups, what does it mean? What do we do next? How does that affect the way we work and moving forward? So to split up, you want to split up this room, Gary?
Every one of the group facilitators walked back in here saying, wow, that was such a great discussion. People have so much to share. There's so much good stuff. So I just want to emphasize that even though a lot of these rooms are set up with the table here and bleachers here, that they really ought to be in circles, because there's enormous amount of wisdom and experience among everybody at this conference. So I encourage you to use every opportunity you can to meet the folks around you who may not be sitting at a panel, but have come from someplace and have brought a lot of wisdom with them. So are we missing a couple of groups?
Yeah, I think let's go ahead.
Go ahead.
All right, so we're going to get started with the groups who are here. What we're going to do is we're going to ask the scribe from each group to raise your hand. And if you can give me one example of something, either a theme that came up several times, or something that seemed to be particularly exciting to your group, or something that synthesizes. So can I see a volunteer from any of the group scribes? See anybody? Okay, I have one here.
Can we cheer for him?
Yay!
Over here. I got on the inside. Okay.
Yeah, there was a woman from Raleigh who was talking about a campaign that they had. They used a phone bank to identify supporters of an anti-war initiative that they had going, and it kind of like snowballed from initially the phone bank served a purpose of raising awareness, and from that they got people that were interested in doing things, and so they began to send out a questionnaire and mobilize volunteers, and eventually that led to identifying the assets of all the different people they had. For instance, to do the phone bank, they used a travel agency, and they had phones available. They also had people with very large houses that were able to basically, throw big parties and fundraise that way. And another thing, another big theme that we had as far as mobilizing constituencies is making it very easy for people to contribute. And we talked a lot about MoveOn.org and the fact that they give you very small things that you can do that are very easy. And when they ask for money, it's not towards a general cause or campaign. It's like to get this ad in the New York Times tomorrow. And that's very specific, down to earth, and real for people. That is very important with kind of an issue like this. It's really general and theoretical.
I think we gave a couple of good examples there, especially identifying the assets that you have, and tapping into the assets that you have among your groups together, making it easy for people to contribute, being specific. Can we another scribe come down and come on in? All right.
Gail, can you
Raise your hand. You want to know about the phone bank?
see her?
Woman here in the red hair.
Okay, I'm from Group 4, and we had a lot of really inspiring stories. Most of them had relatively little to do with foundation funding, just FYI. Anyway, several people in our group talked about strategies that they used to basically gather data that would help them to hold various groups accountable. So we had one woman who, I think it was in the 80s, who had worked with this a NOW chapter to gather information about how few women's voices were on the air, and she had her group had a direct effect on pressuring the station to make a lot of really significant changes, including a woman anchor person down the line. And then another inspiring example of this kind of data gathering strategy took place in Seattle that Mike Wiseman talked about, and it had to do with studying the issue of the digital divide and coming up with some findings that were rather controversial, namely that the divide was quite narrow. And so using that data to substantiate the fact that there's been a great deal of success in that area when it comes to putting computers into the hands of people, and that that activists from other movements were mobilized around that issue and responded in a way that was extremely effective. They used data to do that, and they partnered with some non-traditional allies, including corporations like including the Gates Foundation and money that came from other corporate sources. So I guess I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Can we have another scribe from a group?
Hi, Group 5. We had an extraordinary number of, amazing success stories. I'm just going to focus on two strategies. One is the Media Alliance in San Francisco did a great job bridging between what the national groups were doing on the FCC fight and then working with local community-based groups to pull together an alliance, getting 800 people at a city council hearing and pushing the issue in that way, but being that bridge between those national policy groups and the local groups. Another group in LA working with making sure to organize all of the social justice groups and disaffected groups to have a collective media strategy tied to direct action, like calls, phone banking calls to media outlets to raise an issue, raise awareness on an issue, and also using, in terms of fundraising, I know people are concerned about how to get money to support this work, thinking about going to the people who fund a specific issue like hunger and getting money for the media work through that route, as opposed to thinking that there are media funders out there, because guess what, folks, there are very few. So, thanks.
scribe from a group?
I was the scribe for Group 1, and we had a lot of great stories, and I'll just focus on the highlights here. The Arkansas Indie Media has decided that they're not going to try to reform the Walmart media that's taken over their state, and so Arkansas Indie Media is an unlikely place for that group to be flourishing, but they are, and they have a print project. They've just been in existence for about a year, and they already have a print project going, and some kind of media project going too. He left, so I can't get any more details on that. But the fact is that it seems like a pretty unlikely place for indie media to be flourishing right under Walmart's doorstep, and yet they are. We had a girl from Seattle who talked about, this is a good idea, using the mainstream media's events to form a counter event. There was a 2002 National Association of Broadcasters event out in Seattle, and so they took that opportunity to form kind of a counter event, Reclaim the Media. So the other groups met for a half day and kind of took a little bit of energy away from the main event and had a chance to dialogue and actually brought in people so that the groups themselves had somebody to kind of moderate them, and I think that's an important component. Any of us who have sat in these meetings and we tried to do it ourselves, but sometimes having an outside source in there can be a real valuable thing. I'm from Kansas City, Ben and I are, and one of the successes we've had is at our our own Rolling Thunder event, which is Jim Hightower's traveling county fair with a conscience. We mobilized with the anti-FTA March to Miami that was going through, and it modified our event so that we could strengthen what is now going to be a permanent blue-green coalition in Kansas City. So we brought the labor groups together and the environmentalists together, and they're like, hey, we can kick some butt. So so that was some of the success stories we had.
This is pretty cool. I just want to say, I think this is really cool.
I'm from Group 2. We had quite a few different suggestions and ideas, but one theme that kept coming up was networking. And as you might expect, a lot of that networking was done by the internet. People being able to meet with each other and speak to each other either through blogs or through just a dialogue facilitated by the internet. But several events were face-to-face. Conferences or booths or tabling where people could meet with other people and get messages out in that way. There was one project that I found very interesting, and I'm subjectively picking that one out to hold up as a single one, and that is Pacifica is starting a new program, and Ursula, I think, ducked out of the room, so she could explain it better, unfortunately, but called the PACE program, and several components to it, two of which are what she calls an MP3 warehouse, which will enable, some people have heard of it, enable people, producers of other radio stations to download programs and rebroadcast them. So those of us that have less active community radio stations could put pressure on our own stations to download Pacifica broadcasts and put them on in our market. Another component of it that I find even more exciting is that they want to, and I think the program was called Sprout, they want to enable local producers out in the field to collaborate with other producers from across the country and the world to create radio programs that they can then send up the chain to be redistributed by Pacifica. So one of the examples she gave was if you wanted to do a show on, say, the Cancun conference, and you were somewhere in Indiana, didn't have a whole lot of resources, but wanted to do some research, you could use this tool to network with producers from across the country and across the world who could then send you information and recordings that they have to compile into one story. They can then set up the food chain and then redistribute it out to Pacifica and community stations across the country.
We're really tight on time, and so I'm just going to ask Gary to kind of wrap this up for us. But I just think this is an amazing example of what we have here and how many strategies there are and how many things we can learn. And the things that people talked about, recognizing assets, using assets, building networks, using networks, and using other events are all things we can do here. This is an event we can use, we can network, we can find out what assets we have here collectively, tap into each other. So I hope everybody's exchanging phone numbers, exchanging cards, and not just sitting facing a panel.
to get the Listening Project ongoing work, it's the www.omgcenter.org. There is a great directory of all sorts of groups nationally, locally that have worked on this, and it's produced by the Center for International Media Action. And there's the website, you can download it. And lastly, Free Speech TV is a great resource if you're doing stuff and want a partner to get your message out. And there's also obviously many others. Thank you very much.